Ancient Egypt is famous for its pyramids, pharaohs, and golden treasures. But behind these grand images, the Egyptian record also hints at darker tales of crime and murder. Were there ever shadowy murderers stalking the streets of Thebes, or a ruthless poisoner lurking under the pharaoh's nose? Perhaps so. To find out, we'll have to look at the underbelly of pharaonic Egypt, cases of repeated murder, and notorious criminals from the Old Kingdom all the way to the end of the Ptolemaic period. While the modern term serial killer did not quite exist in antiquity, the ancient Egyptians were certainly no strangers to homicide, whether in the form of palace conspiracies, revenge killings, or just the old-fashioned violent crime for personal gain. Our time together today will discuss each era of Egyptian history, from the Old Kingdom Pyramid Age to the cosmopolitan age of Cleopatra, and each time had its own infamous murderers and misdeeds. But remember, the goal here is not to sensationalize and even romanticize these tragedies, but it's mainly to understand how ancient Egyptians recorded and responded to multiple acts of murder. We must remember that Egyptian society was built on the concept of Maat, meaning truth, order, and justice. An ideal pharaoh was expected to uphold Maat, which included protecting the innocent and, of course, punishing wrongdoers. And when it comes to murder, the deliberate act of taking a human life, well, that was considered a direct assault on Maat, a grave sin that demanded severe consequence. Surviving sources suggest that intentional homicide was a capital crime. Later writers like Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BCE describe in vivid detail the harsh fate awaiting a murderer in Egypt. For example, a person who killed his own father or his own mother could be tortured and burned alive as punishment. We cannot be certain how accurately such accounts reflect earlier Egyptian practice, but they do indicate that Egyptians took murder very seriously. Well, unfortunately, unlike Mesopotamia's famous legal codes, no formal law code of pharaonic Egypt has survived to explicitly list punishments for each crime, no such code of Hammurabi or the like. So instead, we are having to rely on a patchwork of king's decrees, court records, and later commentaries to understand how Egyptian justice was carried out. But these sources do show that the death penalty was indeed used for severe crimes like murder or treason, that we do know, and execution could be carried out by methods such as impalement, burning, often in public, to set a warning to others. Lesser crimes were punished with beatings, amputations, or forced labor, but we're not here to talk about them. And yet, despite strict laws, ancient Egypt was not free from murderous violence. Archaeology even provides testimony of the murders. Skeletons have been found with stab wounds and skull trauma, showing that some Egyptians met violent ends beyond what the official texts can record. And so with that in mind, let's get on to the topic for today, but not before I welcome you into the channel. It's good to see any newcomers. If you are new here, I invite you to click that subscribe button. And for those returning, it's good to see you again. This video and every other video on the channel is proudly ad-free. You won't have any interruptions, and this is because of the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who checked out the merch store, and the occasional donation that we receive through the PayPal or over YouTube. So thank you very much. Now, with all that being said, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can begin the topic for today. Well, we better start in the Old Kingdom. Now, when exactly is that? We can't just say Old Kingdom and expect you to know, right? We're talking 2680 to 2180 BCE. Now, this was Egypt's first great age of pyramid building. Of course, we could talk about pre-dynastic and all that, but let's not really go there for the moment. Well, this time is often seen as a age of strong central authority under divine pharaohs. And you might assume that under the watchful eye of god kings like Khufu and Pepi, that crime would be pretty low. Well, indeed, surviving Old Kingdom inscriptions are usually self-laudatory texts about loyal service and kingly generosity. They don't really detail criminal records, not really something that they want to spread the word about. However, in this golden age, those rumors of deadly intrigues and violence reach us through later accounts. An intriguing example comes from the end of the 5th dynasty or the start of the 6th. Pharaoh Teti, the first ruler of the 6th dynasty around 2320 BCE, may have been the victim of history's first recorded assassination. A much later historian, Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC, claimed that King Teti was murdered in a conspiracy led by his own bodyguards, possibly with involvement from Teti's harem. Now that's a pretty startling claim, that the living incarnation of a god could be killed by his own servants. And that's a palace intrigue at the highest level. Well, if this is true, it would indeed be the earliest known case of regicide in Egypt. While no Old Kingdom inscription confirms Teti's cause of death, Manetho's account fits with the circumstantial evidence. Let me explain. You see, first of all, we had Teti's abrupt end to his reign, and then a shadowy successor named Usukare ruling briefly before Teti's son Pepi I restored the line. Egyptologists have speculated that Usukare might have been a usurper involved in Teti's demise. Thus, hidden behind the placid king's list, we can glimpse a possible murder at the royal court, an ancient homicide. Well, another hint of lethal intrigue in the Old Kingdom comes from a remarkable autobiography of an official named Weni, or Unni in some renderings, who served under King Pepi I, that is circa 2300 BCE. Weni's tomb inscription describes his rise in the royal favor and mentions a pretty sensitive assignment. Quote, "His Majesty ordered me to investigate in private the case of the great royal wife, Waret Yamtes, alone. No chief judge was with me, no governor, no witness. I alone was charged with this secret trial." Well, the unfortunate thing is, when he doesn't actually spell out the Queen's crime. But there's been a bit of speculation about it. Later scholars suspect that this was a harem conspiracy, possibly an accusation that Queen Waret Yamtes had plotted against Pepi I, or even committed adultery, which could threaten the succession and the king's life. Now, if a queen were found guilty of plotting to murder the pharaoh, that would certainly be a capital offense. Weni's account implies that the affair was pretty hush-hush, handled personally by the king's trusted man. Didn't want the news to get out and cause a scandal. Must handle things delicately. We do not know the outcome, but presumably, if she was guilty, she would have been eliminated quietly. But this incident in itself shows that even in the Pyramid Age, royal family dramas could turn quite deadly. When a crime involved the king or his household, normal legal procedures were bypassed in favor of discreet justice, reflecting that high-stakes desire to maintain mart by not airing the royal dirty laundry in public view. And here's another fascinating thing. when he stresses his singular role, I alone. I'm sure you caught that in the quote. Perhaps he was quite proud of being the sole witness to a dark chapter in the palace. Or perhaps he was quite proud of having that much trust placed upon him. In any case, while we lack stories of common serial killers from the Old Kingdom, we do see evidence of conspiracies and murders among the elite, proving that ambition and jealousy are just as old as anything else, perhaps even older than the pyramids themselves. But crime in the Old Kingdom was not limited to palace plots, of course. Petty offences, like theft, likely occurred, though records are pretty sparse. The Egyptians of this era were particularly concerned with tomb robbery, which they viewed as a heinous crime against both the living and the dead. And many tombs inscribed curses threatening doom upon any who would disturb the burial. Such curses indirectly acknowledge the grave robbers, essentially serial offenders preying on multiple tombs, a real menace. Much of the reason why most of our Egyptian artifacts and all the rest have disappeared. Well, the tomb builders tried to deter them by invoking divine vengeance. Well, you might have things like, he who violates this tomb will have his head ripped off by the gods, or something like that. Similar dire fates. Not something that people would want. And while these are formulaic texts, later we will see very real cases of tomb robbers being caught and punished. As for murderers among commoners, our evidence from the Old Kingdom is virtually nil, likely because local murders were handled quietly or simply unrecorded. But the absence of that evidence is not evidence of absence. It doesn't mean that such violence never occurred. It well and truly did. Human nature being what it is, I don't think we need to stray too far from imagination. But it does suggest that serious crimes were either rare or rarely chronicled, unless they touched the state or high society. It would only be in later periods, when more papyrus documents survive, that we get a clearer picture of homicide at all levels of Egyptian society. Of course, the Old Kingdom collapsed eventually, and that collapse ushered in a time of disunity, known as the First Intermediate Period. Now this was 2180 to 2040 BCE. Egypt fragmented into rival regions, and later Egyptian literature portrays this era as one of complete chaos, the old order completely crumbling to bits. While our focus is on serial killers rather than broad history, it's pretty relevant that the Egyptians themselves believed crime and violence had become rampant in this period. And there is a famous Middle Kingdom literary text called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, which imagines an elder or sage lamenting the state of the land during a breakdown of order. In Ipuwer's vivid, if possibly exaggerated descriptions, the land is full of blood, and plunderers are everywhere. Doesn't sound very good, doesn't it? He speaks of servants attacking their masters, the poor robbing the rich, and widespread bloodshed. A kind of social inversion where law and justice have completely vanished. While this text is somewhat poetic and not an eyewitness chronicle, it certainly reveals memories of real instability when central rule had faltered. There is another text too, the Instruction of Medicare. It also refers to a time of violence and urges a young king to restore order and not kill unjustly. So what do they indicate? Well, it is perhaps so that the Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom looked back on the preceding Dark Age as a time when murder and crime went unchecked, especially instructing the young king to not kill unjustly. You don't tell somebody to do that unless they've done it before, you know. In any case, we have one actual figure from the First Intermediate Period who left an autobiographical tomb inscription under the provincial governor, Anktifi. He ruled in southern Upper Egypt around 2100, during the chaotic period, and boasts about how he saved his people from famine and strife. Anktifi's text isn't a confession of crimes, quite the opposite. He presents himself as quite a heroic savior. But in his boasting, he inadvertently confirms how bad things were elsewhere. And this is where we get a little bit of a hint into things. He mentions that in other districts people were resorting to cannibalism and civil violence during the famine, whereas in his domain, he kept everybody fed and orderly. Now read between the lines. Anktifi implies that law and morality broke down in some places, starving people, committing extreme acts, even murdering for food out of desperation. But again, hold your horses. We can't be submitting any of this into an academic peer review quite yet. The account serves to glorify himself, but it aims with the general picture that central authority had collapsed, violent crime had surged. So perhaps a little bit of exaggeration, but certainly something that we can go on. Essentially, Egypt's first dark age might have seen the kind of lawlessness that breeds serial violence, though we have no specific names of individual murderers from the time. But this is an investigation. So remember, we have to try our hardest to find things. And using a little bit of imagination, well, I'm not opposed to it. Now, by the end of the first intermediate period, the kings of Thebes, that is, Upper Egypt, reconquered the land and founded the Middle Kingdom. With stability returning, the Egyptians looked with quite a bit of relief, but also a tinge of disdain at the prior anarchy. While we don't have detailed case files of murderers from the Dark Age, the very fact that literature is constantly emphasizing robbery and murder as rampant ills suggests that there was certainly on people's minds. And that context is very important for us. It shows that Egyptians were fully aware that without strong justice, anyone could get away with anything, and society could descend into a nightmare of bloodshed. Thus, the Middle Kingdom rulers made a point to re-establish courts, laws, and the primacy of Maat to prevent a repeat of such chaos. Now, this is where we get into a little bit more abundant writing. We actually start to get documentation of real murder cases and conspiracies, including one of the most dramatic regicides in Egyptian history. So let's have a look at the annals of Egyptian crime. You'll find one of the most significant murders occurring around 1960 BCE, and that is the assassination of King Amenemhat I, founder of the 12th dynasty. Now, it's not only remarkable as a royal killing, but also because it spawned ancient literary reflections, and that gives us almost an eyewitness sense to the drama and public sentiment. Amenemhat had brought peace after the previous chaos, but in his 30th regnal year, things didn't go very well for him. Treachery struck. Our evidence comes from the two near-contemporary sources, the Instruction of Amenemhat and the Tale of Sinuhe. The Instruction of Amenemhat is framed as a teaching from the ghost of a slain king to his son Sensuret I, describing how he was betrayed. In the text, Amenemhat warns, quote, "Trust not a brother, no, not a friend. I gave to the poor, I nourished orphans, yet those who ate my bread raised weapons against me." He then recounts the moment of the attack, quote, "It was after supper. When night had come, I was taking my ease, lying on my bed, for I was weary. As I began to drift off to sleep, weapons were brandished against me. I woke to fight, but found it was the guards who plotted. Well, these haunting words, likely written by a court scribe shortly after the king's death, certainly confirm that Amenemhat was indeed set upon by his own trusted guards in a nighttime coup. The attackers apparently caught him off guard in his private chambers. He fought back as best he could, but the text implies that he was overpowered and killed. No one is strong at night, the king laments, acknowledging that even a great ruler can't survive without allies who betrayed him from within, especially when you get woken up in the middle of the night, and you can't find your elbows, and you don't know what's happening, can't separate dreams from reality. Very hard to fight back against two armed attackers in that scenario. Now, this palace assassination sent shockwaves through Egypt. It was an unprecedented breach of Maat. The king, appointed by the gods, struck down by traitors in the dark of night. The tale of Sinuhe, a famous story likely written in the reign of Senusret I, gives another insight into the immediate aftermath. In that tale, Sinuhe is an official who happens to overhear the news of Amenemhat's death while on campaign with Prince Senusret. Sinuhe says, quote, "There was a rumor in the camp. The king has been taken by those who should guard him." Afraid of the uncertainty and possibly a purge to follow, Sinuhe decides to flee Egypt and spends his years in exile. Although fictionalized, the story corroborates the core fact, and that is the fact that Amenemhat I was murdered in a conspiracy, probably involving some members of his harem or royal guard. Who knows how deep it goes? Now, if you caught it, the phrase, "those who should guard him," it's a clear indication of a betrayal by bodyguards and palace insiders, much like Manetho's later note about Teti's fate centuries earlier. It seems history just repeats itself. A strong king falling victim to a serial plot by several conspirators. Friends close, enemies closer. But why? Why did they kill Amenemhat? The text hinted a few cases of court politics. It's complicated, perhaps a struggle over succession. Amenemhat had made his son Senusret I co-regent and heir, but the sudden attack while Senusret was away suggests other factions, or maybe a different queen and her supporters tried to eliminate the king and seize power before Senusret could take the throne. If so, the conspirators were essentially serial murderers in waiting, likely intending to kill not just Amenemhat, but also any rivals to their preferred claimant. However, their plan ultimately failed. Senusret I rushed back, secured the throne, and crushed the conspiracy. Egyptian sources do not list the names of the assassins. They were probably erased or never recorded to avoid giving them any notoriety. But we can surmise their fate. In accordance with Egyptian justice, the traitors would have been executed, possibly in brutal fashion. Think about burning or dismemberment, since regicide was the ultimate crime. And one can imagine that the new king, Senusret, having nearly lost his inheritance, would show no mercy. And thus ends one of Egypt's earliest well-documented murder cases, replete with a bit of primary source testimony. I wish we had more, but, well, unfortunately there's only so much we have for that time period. But I think we can agree that Amenemhat's story shows how political murder could occur at the highest level and how Egyptians themselves interpreted it. as a cautionary tale about trust and a reaffirmation that Mart must swiftly be restored by punishing the guilty and continuing the royal lineage. Interestingly, beyond the palace, the Middle Kingdom also produced glimpses of local criminal cases. We do not have specific serial killers in a modern sense, but we hear of individual homicides and legal responses. One Middle Kingdom text, often cited, is the so-called legal complaint of Kunum Nacht, concerning the murder of a peasant. But the text is unfortunately fragmentary, so hold your horses on that one. There are also references to oracles being used to solve crimes. For instance, a papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III in the New Kingdom mentions consulting a divine statue to identify a thief, which shows continuity in legal practices from earlier times. But concrete, Middle Kingdom murder trials are elusive in the records. It's plausible that if someone committed multiple murders in a village or town, local officials would handle it quite quietly, perhaps with a summary execution, leaving no written trace. The absence of, quote, true crime chronicles is partly because Egyptian scribes weren't inclined to memorialize such dark deeds, unless they had political significance or some sort of instructive value. Well, let's move now to the New Kingdom, known as Egypt's zenith, depending on who you ask, as 1550 to 1070 BCE. It was an era of powerful warrior pharaohs like Ptolemaic III, big construction projects like lavish temples, and also international prominence. Good times. Now, one might think that Egypt's might would make it immune to internal crime, but it was quite the contrary. The New Kingdom provides some of the most intriguing evidence of ancient Egyptian murders and criminal investigations. The empire's wealth actually attracted thieves, and the sprawling royal courts were arenas for intrigue. So, let's have a look at both political murders and criminal violence in the New Kingdom, from the mysterious deaths of royalty to the calculated depredations of tomb robbers and corrupt officials. So first, let's begin by considering a royal mystery that has quite fascinated modern observers: the early death of the pharaoh Tutankhamun around 1323 BCE. Now, Tutankhamun, the boy king of the 18th dynasty, is world famous today, not because of his achievements in life, but because of his intact tomb. But his demise, at the early age of 19 years old, remains somewhat mysterious. For many years there was speculation that Tutankhamun might have been murdered, perhaps by his powerful vizier and soon-to-be successor, Ai, or by the ambitious general Horemheb. Well, this theory arose from early examinations of his mummy that noted a skull fracture, suggesting a blow to the head. You don't get one of them by accident. While more recent forensic studies lean towards an alternate cause: severe leg fracture leading to gangrene, possibly combined with malaria, which doesn't help, and the skull damage, that might have been post-mortem. However, the very notion that a young pharaoh's sudden death could have been foul play is quite plausible given the fraught climate of the politics. Tutankhamun's death left a power vacuum. He had no surviving children. His widow, Queen Now hang on, let me take this one slow. Ankhesenamun, excuse me for the break there, took the extraordinary step of writing to the Hittite king, that is Egypt's rival at the time, asking for one of his sons in marriage, claiming, quote, "I am afraid I do not wish to take a servant as a husband." Servant also having the connotations of a commoner. And the Hittite king obliged. He sent his son Prince Zananza. But the prince never made it to Egypt. He was killed on the route there, almost certainly by Egyptian operatives who intercepted him. Well, this international incident, is recorded in the Hittite archives. It strongly indicates that a faction at the Egyptian court, likely led by General Horemheb and others opposed to a foreigner on the throne, orchestrated the assassination of the Hittite prince. And soon after, Ankhesenamun disappears, possibly forced into marriage with Ai, then eliminated, and Ai becomes pharaoh briefly, followed by Horemheb, who claimed to restore order. It's quite a bit of cloak and dagger, isn't it? And it shows a series of killings behind the scenes. Tutankhamun dies under dubious circumstance. The Hittite prince is deliberately killed, and quite possibly Ankhesenamun herself was removed. While we lack a direct Egyptian narrative of these events, we're still pretty lucky to have the Hittite one. But unsurprisingly, since all of the victors wouldn't advertise their crimes, that's for sure, the Hittites would have felt quite annoyed by the whole situation, understandably though. Still, the convergence of clues paints to a picture of serial political murders undertaken to control succession. And that's just another chilling reminder that the struggle for the throne in Egypt could be as lethal as any modern power game, even if couched in terms of divine will and legitimacy. Doesn't make the murders any less murderous, I suppose. But there's another instance in the 18th dynasty that we should talk about, and it involves Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. You might have heard of Hatshepsut. She was a powerful female pharaoh who co-ruled for years. She died likely of natural causes, but soon after her death, Thutmose III, her stepson, ordered her name and images to be defaced on monuments. The Latin term is damnatio memoriae, basically sending your memory into oblivion. Well, some have wondered if this indicates a violent falling out, or even the possibility that Thutmose might have had her killed to finally assume sole power. Most scholars think Hatshepsut was not murdered. Her mummy shows an obese woman in her 50s who had cancer and bad teeth, consistent with a natural death. Thutmose's erasure of her name was probably a political attempt to affirm traditional male kingship after the fact. But still, the optics are undeniably striking, a ruler effectively being erased from history by her successor, which in a sense is character assassination if not literal. We mentioned this to illustrate that violence in royal transitions could take on many forms, if not outright killing, then destruction of memory, which Egyptians viewed as a kind of fate almost as bad as death, or perhaps even worse. In the later 19th dynasty, another bit of intrigue rises with Pharaoh Merneptah's succession around 1213. Merneptah was the son of the great Ramesses II. One obscure record suggests that there was a plot involving one of Merneptah's own sons named Seti, who may have attempted a coup. A papyrus known as the Athens Papyrus appears to reference a conspiracy during Merneptah's reign, possibly foiled, but the details are scant. But if such a conspiracy occurred, it is likely entailed a plan to murder the pharaoh and put another on the throne. Again, serial treason that could involve multiple assassins. Merneptah evidently survived and punished the conspirators. Better luck next time, kid. But as for the specifics of this, it's pretty much lost. What survives does fit a pattern, though. The new kingdom progressed, and the royal line grew complicated. Many sons, many wives, too many moving parts. Palace plots became a recurring theme, and this set the stage for the most famous Egyptian murder case of all, which unfolded in the next dynasty. The Harem Conspiracy of 1155, perhaps the best documented assassin plot in Egyptian history, at least ancient Egyptian history, and it succeeded in claiming the life of a pharaoh, so it was obviously quite well planned. The victim was Ramesses III, the last great ruler of the New Kingdom. By his 30th year on the throne, Ramesses III was an aging king with many wives and children, and behind the scenes there was a deadly struggle for succession brewing. One of his secondary wives, Queen Tai, was determined to see her own son, Prince Pentawere, inherit the throne, instead of the designated crown prince, who was likely the son of the primary queen. To achieve this, Tai and Pentawere conspired with a network of officials inside the palace, harem, and beyond. What makes the conspiracy extraordinary is that we have the actual court records of the subsequent trial, preserved in the judicial papyrus of Turin and related documents. These papyri read almost like an ancient detective book or courtroom manuscript. It gives the names of the plotters, the crimes, and their punishments. From these records we learn that the conspirators' plan involved murdering Ramesses III during a harem gathering, essentially an inside job, exploiting access to the king's private chambers. They recruited accomplices, including chamberlains, royal butlers, treasury officials, and even magicians. Indeed, one fascinating element was the use of magic spells and wax figurines to try and incapacitate or kill enemies. The plotters attempted a little bit of sorcery as part of the arsenal. I suppose. See if that works out for them. In any case, at the critical moment, the king was attacked. And although the papyrus is damaged where it describes the act, it is clear that violence occurred. For a long time, historians have debated whether Ramesses III actually died in the attack or survived it. But this is where modern forensic science comes in. In 2012, a CT scan of Ramesses III's mummy revealed a deep slash in his throat under the bandages that likely cut his windpipe and major blood vessels. In other words, his throat was slit. Pretty obvious. He was indeed assassinated, confirming the conspirators accomplished their grim goal. However, killing the pharaoh, that was only half of the scheme. The ultimate goal was to place Pentawere on the throne, and in that regard, they failed. Ramesses III's loyalist, including his chosen heir, now Ramesses IV, reacted swiftly. The trial papyrus indicates that over 30 people were implicated in the coup and brought to justice. Judges, who were actually selected from the royal butler staff, perhaps to ensure loyalty, interrogated and convicted those accused. Some of the culprits were high-ranking. Among them were women of the harem, likely including Tai herself, and numerous male officials. The language of the papyrus is terse but damning, its speaks of defendants being found guilty of conspiring to kill their lord and similar charges. And the punishments for that, I'm sure you can imagine, are quite severe. Most of the convicted were sentenced to death. The papyrus often uses the phrase, "they caused them to die," which is a delicate way of saying execution. A few, interestingly, were allowed or forced to do the deed themselves, especially those of royal blood. Prince Pentawere himself faced his fate. The record states that Pentawere was tried, placed before the judges, who found him guilty, and then he took his own life. It's ambiguous whether Pentuere was given the option to poison himself or whether he was effectively executed, and the phrasing just masks it. Ancient sources suggest Pentuere either poisoned himself or was made to hang himself. But in any case, he did not escape punishment, and he certainly did not get the throne. Others in the plot had their noses and ears cut off before being executed or exiled, indicating different degrees of penalty depending on involvement. Really, I'm surprised they didn't just execute everybody, to be honest with you. In any case, there is quite a haunting relic of this affair. It's the so-called screaming mummy, identified in recent times as likely the remains of Prince Pentuere. Unlike most royals, this man was not given the traditional mummification rites. His body was rather found in a cache of royal mummies, but wrapped in a sheep skin, which was considered to be ritually impure, and with his mouth open in a grotesque, screaming fashion. This unusual burial treatment suggests he was disgraced and possibly died in agony. DNA tests in 2012 confirmed that this mummy was a son of Ramesses III, lining up perfectly with Pentuare's story. Oh, how lucky we are to have modern science. But it's chilling to stand face to face, in a museum at least, with the actual physical evidence of an ancient regicide and its aftermath. The murdered father and treacherous son, their mummies resting side by side for millennia after such a drama. The harem conspiracy certainly stands out as unique, because it reveals a complex plot involving multiple murders, or intended murders. They not only killed the king, but presumably planned to eliminate any who opposed Pentuere's coronation. It was a case of serial killing in a political context, coordinated among a group. The subsequent investigation shows how seriously the Egyptians took such crimes. The trial seems to have been thorough, though you must wonder if torture was used to extract confessions. Use your imagination. Some lines certainly hint that truth potions or magical oaths might have been employed, whatever that means. The judges at one point even themselves got into trouble for fraternizing with some of the female defendants. Apparently a couple of judges had wine parties with the women during the trial. Now, if that's not an act of gross misconduct, I don't know what is. In any case, the judges got punished too for that. What on earth is going on down there, huh? I don't know. Anyway, that's a pretty juicy detail, isn't it? The trial itself had drama, but ultimately order was restored. Ramesses IV took the throne. The conspirators were either killed or sent to some far-off land in exile, and scribes recorded the event as a warning. We have in one episode a vivid example of how even the mightiest can fall to a coordinated serial plot, and how Egyptian justice responded with both merciless punishment and, very luckily for us, meticulous record-keeping of the outcome. Now, the next section is a little bit of a stray from the topic, but it's important in the general context of how Egyptians saw death. You have two deaths, your earthly death and your spiritual death. So we're going to talk a little bit about tomb robbing now. Not all killers in ancient Egypt were motivated by politics or dynastic ambition. Some were driven by greed, operating in the shadows to prey on the dead or the living. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was struggling economically and internally. The grandeur of the pharaohs like Ramesses II had given way to a weaker state in the 20th dynasty, and weak states are rife with corruption. In this environment, tomb robbery became a rampant problem, and it often went hand in hand with violence, as we'll see. The royal necropolis in Thebes, i.e. the Valley of the Kings, it was home to unimaginable riches. And as the government faltered, even the workers entrusted with these tombs, or officials tasked with guarding them, sometimes turned to thievery. The tomb robbers of Egypt can be likened to serial burglars. A few of them also did not shy away from murder if necessary to achieve their aims or silence witnesses. We actually have detailed records of tomb robbery trials from the reigns of Ramesses the 9th and the 11th, around 1100 BC, known as the Abbott Papyrus and Amherst Papyrus, by the way, if you want to look them up. Well, these documents list thieves and the tombs they violated as well as their punishments. Many robbers once caught were executed, often by impalement, which shows that these crimes were considered capital offenses, perhaps not far from how we treat a serial killer today in terms of severity. One of the most colorful characters from this time was Paneb, a man whose story survives on a papyrus, that is Papyrus Salt 124, that reads like an ancient criminal story. It's quite interesting. You see, Paneb was not a humble tomb raider sneaking into pyramids. Rather, he was the foreman of the royal tomb workers' village Deir el-Medina during the late 19th dynasty. It's around 1200. This village housed the skilled artisans who built and decorated the pharaohs' tombs in the valleys of the kings. As foreman, Paneb held the position of trust and quite a bit of authority. But according to the record left by a rival, he was utterly corrupt and violent. In fact, if any individual in ancient Egypt could be called a serial criminal, documented in detail, Paneb fits the bill. The papyrus is essentially a long list of Paneb's misdeeds, written by a fellow worker named Amenakte, who sought to expose Paneb to the vizier and have him removed. So what's the rap sheet? What did Paneb do? Well, the list is pretty shocking in its breadth. We're talking grave robbery, adultery, assault, theft, and possibly murder. He was accused of stealing valuable stones and tomb furnishings, including items from the very tomb of Pharaoh Seti II that his crew had worked on. He allegedly appropriated temple offerings, oil and wine for his own use, and even took over a tomb for his personal family burial, kicking out the rightful owner's remains. Paneb is also said to have bribed officials to get his foreman job in the first place and to escape earlier punishments. Now, in terms of violence, the papyrus describes Paneb attacking colleagues in drunken rages, at one point beating several men in a single night. Particularly telling is the incident where Paneb reportedly chased and threatened to kill the previous foreman. That was his own adoptive father, no less, a man named Neferhotep. Now it is implied, though not outright stated, that Neferhotep later died under suspicious circumstance, possibly at Paneb's instigation. The text says that Neferhotep was killed by an enemy, and later interpretations certainly put the blame on Paneb as that enemy. Now, if true, Paneb would certainly be guilty of murder. Moreover, there's other crimes of him making assaults upon women in the village, including at least one married woman and even one of his own relatives. And that paints a picture of a complete psychopath, someone who terrorized the community over many years while abusing his power. Amenakte's letter is dripping with frustration at how Paneb had gotten away with it for so long. It suggests that Paneb had powerful royal patrons, or was just very adept at evading justice. Perhaps because the period was so tumultuous. The 19th dynasty, especially in its late part, saw civil strife and short reigns. Maybe priorities were just different. However, we do know that eventually the authorities did take action. Paneb's name disappears from records thereafter. implying he was finally prosecuted and likely executed or at least removed. Thus, Paneb's case provides a rare glimpse of a non-royal serial offender in ancient Egypt. Unlike the high-profile conspirators we discussed earlier, Paneb was a commoner, albeit an important artisan whose crimes affected ordinary people, and a pharaonic property, rather than royal succession. And yet, thanks to Amenakte's dossier, we can almost follow Paneb's career of criminality. Shows that even in well-policed communities, a sufficiently ruthless individual could commit repeated acts of violent acts of theft and all other sorts of crimes, effectively making him a one-man crime wave. Well, the fact that Paneb's scandal was recorded and preserved is quite remarkable, and nonetheless because it was done accidentally in a tomb or rubbish heap until found by modern archaeologists. It allows us to say that ancient Egypt had its share of what we might call a serial criminal, someone who engages over years of patterned criminal behavior. Paneb may have only killed once, or perhaps not at all if one gives the benefit of the doubt on Neferhotep's death. So serial killer in the strict modern sense might be a bit of a stretch, but I wanted to include him in here. He was clearly prone to violence, and it's no stretch of the imagination that he would have killed if it suited him. The villagers of Deir el-Medina, who lived in close quarters, would have viewed him with fear and loathing, as the document's tone suggests. But Paneb also demonstrates that play between crime and corruption. He leveraged bribery and maybe a bit of political turmoil to get away with crimes that normally would have led to immediate, severe punishment. Money talks, I suppose. Ancient Egyptian justice was swift and harsh when it functioned, but like any system, it could be thwarted by nepotism, or just chaos. Well, by around 1100, the end of the New Kingdom, tomb robbery reached epic proportions. Even the royal tombs were not spared. Investigators found that many were robbed by organized gangs, often with inside help. Some of those robbers, no doubt, would kill if cornered. In one tomb robbery papyrus, the thief admits how they tunneled into King Sobek-Masaf's pyramid and took treasures. And you might imagine any guards or innocent bystanders who got in the way might have met a violent end. The texts don't explicitly mention murders during thefts, but we can use a bit of imagination. Not too much, but a bit of imagination. The logic of the death penalty for tomb robbery, however, was partly because these crimes were seen as offenses against the gods and king, but also because they could involve assault or murder of tomb guardians. In essence, the thieves were potential multiple killers, if not of living people, then of the dead in a spiritual sense, robbing those passed away of their proper afterlife. Egyptians believed that disturbing a mummy could doom its soul, and that's kind of a metaphysical murder. So how do we sum up this period? Well, the late New Kingdom and the tail end of that era were marked by rampant criminality. From rogue officials like Paneb to organized tomb raiders, the Egyptian state responded fiercely when it caught them and if it could catch them. Impalement and burning were used to make examples of such people. It's sobering that as Egypt's fortunes waned, the frequency of recorded crimes actually increased, a correlation between social stress and crime familiar to criminologists today. The ancients themselves might have seen it as mart breaking down in real time, requiring strong measures to set it right. But now let's move forward into the first millennium BCE, where Egypt was often ruled by foreigners, that being Libyans, Nubians, Persians, or split regionally. Yet, even amid these changes, the theme of serial killing and conspiratorial murder continued, especially within the realm of dynastic feuds, which we'll cover. The Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period of Egypt, it lasted from 1070 to 332 BCE. Pretty complex. Many dynasties, many short-lived kings, and a couple of foreign invasions too, just for good measure. Can't go without them, can't we? Well, while detailed records from this time are fewer, some striking incidents of murder have come down to us. One particularly dramatic account involves a high priest turned pharaoh named Osirkon III in the 8th century. As recorded in later chronicles, an attempt was made on the life of Osirkon when he was still the high priest of Amun at Thebes. Rebels plotted treason against him. Their exact aims? A little unclear. But they likely intended to kill Osirkon and seize power. Unlike some previous pharaohs, Osirkon did not fall victim. He discovered the conspiracy just in time, captured the perpetrators, and personally meted out summary justice. It is said that Osirkon killed the conspirators with his own hands and burned their bodies in public. The extrajudicial retribution bypasses any formal trial, indicating that Osirkon wanted to make a swift and terrifying example. In effect, he acted as a judge, jury, and executioner. Stark reminder that in a system where the ruler is the ultimate authority, the response to a failed assassination could itself be a kind of sanctioned serial killing. Osirkon's actions might have been out of anger and intended to deter further plots. But to the Egyptians, who believed the king or even the high priest of Amun carried divine sanction, such immediate punishment might have been seen as God's will manifesting through the ruler. Nevertheless, shows how violent the politics of the Third Intermediate Period could be. Fragmented power and frequent plots. Not a very stable era at all. Another lens on the late period attitudes to murder comes again from outside observers. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, recounts a number of curious Egyptian customs and stories. In one anecdote, he describes how the pharaoh Amasis of the 6th century dealt with a domestic murder, supposedly a sacrilegious act like killing a cat considered sacred, could even provoke mob violence. But if a person was murdered, formal justice was sought. Unfortunately, Herodotus doesn't give specific Egyptian murder cases except legendary ones. He does tell of a tale of Rampsinitus, the treasury of Rampsinitus, where a cunning thief outwitted the king. In that tale, the thief's brother gets caught and is killed, and then the thief murders his own brother to conceal his identity, a kind of macabre twist, albeit in service of theft rather than malice. Herodotus also mentions that Egypt was greatly strict about having people declare their livelihood, a law that supposedly said if someone couldn't explain how they made their living, they could be punished as a thief. The implication is that systematic crime like serial theft or repeated brigandage was something pharaohs tried to stamp out via regulation. In the Persian period, it is the 27th dynasty after 525 BCE, Egypt was under foreign rule, and some Greek sources claim the Persian king Cambyses behaved brutally in Egypt. They allege he killed the sacred Apis bull and executed high officials wantonly. Now, if that is true, Cambyses might count as a kind of serial killer from the Egyptian perspective, though modern historians suspect some exaggerations in the accounts to paint Cambyses as mad, just a psycho that lost his mind. But still, it is clear that in those tumultuous years there were a lot of violent conflict and reprisal. Egyptian rebels against Persia, like those led by Amyrtaeus or later by Nectanebo, often ended in massacres when suppressed. In these cases, though, we are talking about warfare and repression, which, while involving mass killings, doesn't quite fall under the category of the serial killer, more under state violence rather than criminal pathology. But there was one fascinating late period legal development, and that was the codification of laws under the Said dynasty of the 26th dynasty, that is, and later under Persian rule. Darius I purportedly ordered a compilation of Egyptian laws. Now, from the limited records we have, it seems local courts were expected to investigate even private homicides, not only crimes against the state. There is also a mention, rather, of an official duty to look into obscure deaths in one document. Now, this suggests that by the late period, even though no formal police force existed, far from it, regional governors took murders seriously and would pursue a killer even if the victim's family did not. The Egyptians by this time had a long tradition of valuing human life and retributive justice. A murderer on the loose would offend both religious and legal sensibilities. The concept of vengeance in the afterlife also appears. The Egyptians believed that the souls of murdered victims could haunt the perpetrator or call out for justice. In fact, an inscription from a much earlier period, the 12th dynasty, known as the Hungry Cheetah text, tells of a spirit of a murdered man appealing to the living to properly bury him and punish his killer. Well, if any era of Egyptian history saw something close to the modern perception of a serial killer in the royal sense, it was certainly the Ptolemaic period, sort of the sunset of ancient Egypt, 323 to 30 BCE. Now, who were the Ptolemies? Well, they weren't Egyptian, actually. They were a Macedonian Greek dynasty that took over Egypt after Alexander the Great. And they brought with them both Hellenistic court intrigue and the old pharaonic penchant for sibling rivalry, often solved by old-fashioned murder. The Ptolemaic family's internal conflicts were as lethal as any drama in antiquity. It was practically a tradition for Ptolemaic kings and queens to eliminate their kin to secure power. And while these were politically motivated murderers, and the sheer number of repeat patterns certainly qualify them as a kind of serial family killing spree across generations. A very grim tradition, I suppose. So a prime example is Ptolemy VIII Ergetes II, nicknamed Psychon, which actually meant potbelly, a kind of backhanded insult to his poor figure. In the 2nd century BC, Psychon engaged in a vicious feud with his sister and wife Cleopatra II. That is not the Cleopatra you're thinking of. There was many different Cleopatras. Well, Cleopatra II had previously been married to their older brother Ptolemy VI, and after his death, Ptolemy VIII married her and jointly ruled. But relations soured, especially after Ptolemy took Cleopatra's daughter, as a second wife. Cleopatra II started a rebellion against him in Alexandria, and Ptolemy's response was one of the most gruesome acts recorded in Ptolemaic history. He murdered their teenage son, Ptolemy Memphites, who was not only Cleopatra's beloved child, but also his own son. Well, then he had the corpse cut into pieces and sent to the queen in a box as a birthday present. Not what she wanted, but that's what she got. Ancient writers like Justin and Plutarch relay this horror with the appropriate revulsion. This act was both personal vengeance and a terror tactic. By mutilating their son, Ptolemy demonstrated the lengths he would go to hold power. Certainly marks him as one of the cruelest monarchs in Egyptian history, arguably earning the label of psychopath by modern standards. But that wasn't his only kill. Earlier, when he seized power in 145, Ptolemy had arranged the assassination of the young co-king, his nephew, son of Ptolemy VI. In essence, Sicon killed off any male relatives that could challenge him, a serial pattern of eliminating brothers, nephews, and even his own children. Now the Cleopatra the people know, that is Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic queen, was no stranger to these deadly family politics either. To solidify her grip on the throne, Cleopatra likely ordered the murder of her younger brother Ptolemy XIV in 44 BCE. Now he had been her co-ruler, in name at least, after the death of her older brother Ptolemy XIII, who died in a civil war against Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, drowning in the Nile battle. With Ptolemy XIII gone, Cleopatra married the even younger brother Ptolemy XIV. But once she had a son with Julius Caesar, and Caesar himself was killed in Rome, Cleopatra had apparently no more use for this new Ptolemy XIV. The historical accounts imply that he died around the age of 15. Shortly thereafter, her toddler son was elevated as co-king. Now, most historians conclude that Cleopatra quietly poisoned him to remove any rival claim, a time-honored Ptolemaic method. Additionally, Cleopatra had a sister, Arsinoe IV, who had opposed her during the Alexandrian War, even briefly declaring herself queen with support of the Egyptian populace. Caesar exiled Arsinoe to a temple in Ephesus. A few years later, Cleopatra, wanting to eliminate this rival once and for all, persuaded Mark Antony to have Arsinoe assassinated on the temple steps. A blatant violation of sanctuary, that's for sure. Ancient sources describe this dark deed, noting it caused scandal, as murdering someone in a sacred precinct was shocking. But Cleopatra was determined to have no contender to the throne, even her own sibling. They all had to go. The Ptolemies, in effect, normalized this intra-family murder to a chilling extent. Brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, and children, they all fell victim over the dynasty's 3 centuries. This chronic bloodletting was partly a result of their complex marriages and the volatile politics of the Hellenistic era, and it provides ample glory anecdotes, which later historians like Plutarch recounted with a kind of morbid fascination. While these killings were aimed at securing power, rather than satisfying some personal bloodlust, they demonstrate the repetitive serial nature of dynastic murder. The serial killers here were not lone madmen, but calculating monarchs who resorted to serial homicide as a political tool. But it is worth noting that the Egyptian religion and tradition did not condone such bloodshed. In fact, the myth of Osiris, the beloved god-king murdered by his jealous brother Set, cast fratricide as the ultimate evil. Ironically, the Ptolemies, who liked to style themselves as gods and pharaohs, ended up reenacting the role of Set repeatedly. One does wonder how ordinary Egyptians perceived these events. Perhaps many of them were appalled, but it doesn't matter when you're powerless, I suppose. Others may have been desensitized after generations of the same pattern. Oh, look, it's another pharaoh assassinated. Just another one to the pages of history, I suppose. But there is evidence of occasional uprisings or support for one faction over another, and that suggests that these murders sometimes backfired by fueling civil unrest. For instance, after Sicon's horrific deed, Cleopatra II's faction gained sympathy, and the kingdom was split for a time. In the end, the cycle of violence likely weakened the dynasty overall. When Rome intervened in Egypt's affairs, first by Caesar, then Mark Antony and Octavian, they exploited these eternal divisions. The Ptolemaic line ended with Cleopatra's taking her own life in 30 BCE, after Octavian, that is Augustus, defeated her and Antony. Well, by taking her own life, supposedly the bite of an asp, though that's debatable, Cleopatra cheated Octavian of the satisfaction of parading her as a captive. In a grim way, it was the final murder in the tale. Cleopatra murdering herself, possibly to avoid a worse fate at the hands of her enemies, and to ensure that her legend lived on in a kind of tragic epilogue. And with her death, Egypt fell under Roman rule, and the era of pharaohs, and the deadly backstabbing court intrigues came to an end. And so does our video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, we didn't find as many serial killers as we thought, not in a modern sense, but certainly there. We found a fair few assassins, backstabbers, robbers, all the rest. Certainly colors the Old Kingdom all the way to the Ptolemaic period as quite violent. In any case, we always have to remember there was plenty of these instances going on that just were not recorded. And, well, admittedly, it was much easier to get away with it back then, so who knows? Is where archaeology has to come in. Sometimes we find different bodies somewhere with a wound to the back of the head. So that certainly is something that you can't do to yourself. In any case, what do you think about all of it? If you're still here and you're not asleep at the moment, then leave your thoughts in the comments. You're probably asleep, though. In any case, I hope you're having a good rest. I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Tavri, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftas, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, and Brian. Thank you all so much. And that's it from me today. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed your time here. And I will see you in the next video. Lots of love to you all, and good night.